They didn't vote. They didn't campaign. They didn't need to. While Victorian Britain celebrated its parliament as the pinnacle of democratic civilization, 12 secret societies were meeting in locked rooms and deciding everything that actually mattered. Appointments, contracts, wars, promotions, colonial governors, and the slow ruin of anyone who refused to cooperate. This wasn't conspiracy theory. This was a system. Men gathered weekly. Oaths were sworn. Names were written in books that were never meant to survive. A judge received his seat not because of merit, but because of a handshake exchanged 3 months earlier in a private dining room on Pall Mall. A railway contract worth millions was awarded before the public bid ever opened. A reformer who came too close to the truth was quietly reassigned to a post in India and never heard from again. The system ran for decades without breaking, not because it was perfect, but because the men inside it controlled what got exposed and what got buried. Then the press got faster. The empire got too large to manage in secret, and the records began to surface. What they revealed wasn't just corruption, it was architecture. A shadow government built inside the real one, and 12 organizations that knew exactly how to make power disappear from public sight while keeping it firmly in private hands. To understand how this happened, we need to go back. Not to a battlefield, not to a parliament, not to a royal palace. We need to go back to a room. A small carpeted room with no windows, lit by gas lamps, smelling of tobacco and old leather, somewhere in the heart of London, sometime around 1850. That room is where this story begins. If stories like this one, where what looks like civilization hides something far more deliberate underneath, if that kind of history keeps you up at night the way it keeps me up, consider subscribing and drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching this from? To understand what those rooms contained, we need to understand the world that built them. Victorian Britain was, on its surface, the most orderly civilization the modern world had ever produced. By the middle of the 19th century, London had become the largest city on earth, a metropolis of nearly 3 million people, connected by railways, illuminated by gas, policed by a uniformed constabulary, and governed by institutions that had survived, with modifications, for centuries. The British Parliament sat in a building rebuilt after the fire of 1834, a deliberate act of architectural theatre, Gothic spires and carved stone lancets designed to make power look ancient, inevitable and unquestionable. Newspapers printed the debates in full. The Reform Acts of 1832 and 1867 had expanded the electorate. The appearance of democracy was carefully maintained and aggressively exported. Britain told the world, and told itself, that it was a nation governed by laws, not men. But the laws were written by men, and the men who wrote them belonged to things that had no public record. The British establishment of the Victorian era was not simply a class, it was a network. And networks, by definition, operate through connections that do not appear in official documentation. A boy born into the right family in 1830 did not merely inherit wealth, he inherited access. He was introduced at the appropriate age to the right clubs, the right lodges, the right dining societies. He learned their rituals, he memorized their signals. He understood, without being told explicitly, that what happened inside those rooms stayed inside those rooms, and that the favors exchanged there would shape the rest of his professional life. This was not metaphor, this was mechanism. The technology of the age made the concealment easier. Communication was slow enough that decisions made in London took weeks to reach the colonies, weeks more to be questioned, and months to be revisited. By the time any irregularity surfaced in an official report, the men responsible had already moved on to the next appointment, the next contract, the next name on the list. The empire's vast geography was not just an administrative challenge, it was a buffer. Distance protected the system from scrutiny in ways that no law could have managed on its own. Something was already wrong. It had been wrong for a long time. But in 1850, almost no one outside the network knew how to name it. The man who came closest to naming it, at least in this period, was not a reformer, not a journalist, and not a politician. His name was Sir Randolph Cavendish Mott, a barrister of the Middle Temple, born in 1812 in Bristol, to a family of moderate means and considerable ambition. Cavendish Mott had the misfortune of being brilliant in an era when brilliance without connection was a liability rather than an asset. He had read law with unusual speed, passed his bar examinations with distinction, and by 1838 was widely regarded among his peers as one of the sharpest legal minds of his generation. None of that mattered as much as who he knew, and in 1838 he knew almost no one who mattered. What he did have was observation. Cavendish Mott spent his early years in practice, watching cases move through the courts in patterns that made no legal sense. Men with thin arguments won, men with strong arguments lost. Appointments to the bench went to lawyers who had been unremarkable in practice, but were conspicuously well connected in ways that left no paper trail. He began keeping notes, not formal records, nothing that could be used against him if found, but private observations, written in a cramped, careful hand in a series of notebooks he kept locked in a desk in his chambers at Gray's Inn. Those notebooks would become the closest thing to an internal map of the network that anyone outside it ever produced. His ascent, when it came, was paradoxical. In 1845, Cavendish Mott was approached by a senior partner at a prominent London firm with a proposal: join a particular dining society that met monthly at a private address in St. James's. No further details were offered. The invitation was framed as a professional courtesy. Cavendish Mott accepted, not because he trusted the offer, but because he understood that refusal was its own kind of answer. Inside that room for the first time, he saw the system from the inside. He saw who sat next to whom. He heard what was discussed before the formal agenda began. He watched a circuit court judgeship change hands over a dessert course without a single official process being invoked. And he understood with the cold clarity of a legal mind, trained to read what was not written, that he had been admitted not to a society, but to a machine. For the next decade, Cavendish Mott rose. He took cases he was directed toward. He won judgments he was expected to win. He was introduced, in sequence, to 3 additional organizations, each more selective than the last, each with its own oaths, its own calendar, its own language of gestures and phrases that meant nothing to outsiders and everything to members. By 1855, he held a position of quiet but genuine influence within the network. He had been inside the machine long enough to understand its gears, and something in him, the part that had kept those notebooks since 1838, had never stopped watching. But something was already beginning to fracture. Not inside him, not yet. Inside the system itself. The problem was not exposure, not in 1855. The problem was growth. The British Empire, by the mid-19th century, had expanded to a scale that the original architects of the network had never anticipated. India, Australia, Canada, vast territories in Africa and Southeast Asia, all of them required administrators. And administrators required appointments. And appointments required recommendations. And recommendations flowed through the network. But the network had been designed for a country, not an empire. It had been built around rooms in London and Edinburgh and Oxford, around men who had attended the same schools and belonged to the same clubs, and could look each other in the eye when a favor was asked. As the empire expanded, the room got too crowded for the old intimacy to hold. New men arrived, men from the colonies themselves, men from manufacturing cities, men from families that had money but not history. Some of them were inducted, others were kept at the threshold. But the network's fundamental logic, that membership was controlled by those already inside, began to produce contradictions at scale. A railway commissioner appointed in Calcutta through a London connection turned out to be dangerously incompetent. A colonial judge placed by the network in Cape Colony made decisions so erratic that they generated a formal parliamentary inquiry. The inquiry was contained, as it always was, but the effort required to contain it was greater than anything the network had previously absorbed. The machinery was beginning to strain under its own weight. Cavendish Mott noticed. He wrote about it in his notebooks, carefully, obliquely, in the language of legal analysis rather than accusation. He noted the increasing frequency of what he called corrective actions, interventions required to protect the network from consequences it had itself created. He noted the rising cost, in favors and in silence, of maintaining cohesion across organizations that were no longer operating in the same city, the same culture, or even the same hemisphere. He noted something else too, something he found difficult to name directly even in private. The men at the center of the network were getting older, and the younger men being brought in did not have the same instinct for discretion. They spoke more freely. They wrote more. They trusted the system to protect them without understanding how much effort that protection required. The darkness that had always been inside the machine was beginning to show at the edges. By the 1870s, the cracks were no longer theoretical, they were structural, and the force that widened them most was not a reformer, not a politician, not even a scandal in the conventional sense. It was print. The expansion of the British press in the second half of the 19th century was one of the most significant shifts in the history of public information, and it happened faster than any institution, secret or otherwise, had time to fully absorb. The Education Act of 1870 had set in motion a slow but irreversible rise in mass literacy. Penny papers multiplied. Investigative journalism, still a young practice, began developing methodologies that older forms of reporting had never needed. The cultivation of sources inside institutions, the cross-referencing of public records, the patient accumulation of circumstantial evidence into patterns that could withstand legal challenge. Cavendish Mott, now in his 60s and occupying a senior position in one of the network's oldest constituent bodies, watched this shift with something he could not quite categorize as fear, but could not categorize as confidence either. He had spent 30 years inside a system designed to be invisible. He had seen it survive inquiries, absorb scandals, redirect suspicion, and emerge from each crisis with its essential architecture intact. But those crises had all occurred in a world where the press was slower, the reading public was smaller, and the tools available to anyone trying to map the network from outside were far more limited than the tools now becoming available. The game had changed, and the network, which had survived by never changing, had not yet understood that it needed to. And before we go further, if this story is already making you see familiar systems in an unfamiliar light, consider subscribing to the channel. And tell me in the comments, do you think what you're watching here is history, or does it sound like something still happening right now? The first major exposure did not come from a newspaper, it came from inside. In 1881, a mid-level civil servant named Thomas Aldcroft, a man who had been inducted into one of the 12 societies at the age of 26 and had spent the following 15 years faithfully executing its instructions, walked into the offices of a London evening paper with a collection of letters. Not many, 11 in total, but each one contained, in the careful handwriting of men whose names appeared regularly in the pages of Burke's Peerage, explicit instructions regarding the disposition of government appointments, judicial decisions, and at least 2 contracts awarded through the Board of Trade. Aldcroft was not a crusader. He was not acting out of principle. He had been passed over for a promotion that he had been privately assured was his, passed over in favor of a younger man whose connection to a senior figure in the network was more recent and more useful. He was angry, and anger in this case proved more dangerous to the system than any idealist could have been. The letters were published over 4 consecutive days. The response from the network was swift, practiced, and almost entirely effective. Aldcroft was discredited within a week, his personal finances examined, an old gambling debt surfaced and publicized, his mental stability quietly questioned in parliamentary circles. The editor of the paper was subjected to a libel threat serious enough to require expensive legal defense. 2 of the men named in the letters issued categorical denials that were accepted without serious challenge by the major dailies. Within a month, the story had been largely contained. Aldcroft himself left London and was not heard from again in any public record. But the letters had been read, not by enough people to collapse the system, not nearly, but by enough people to understand that the system existed. And understanding that something exists is the first step toward being unable to unsee it. The network had survived the exposure. What it could not survive over time was the accumulation of exposures, each one small, each one contained, each one followed by a period of apparent normalcy that was, in fact, a period of accelerating fragility. Cavendish Mott died in 1889, His notebooks were found by a nephew who did not understand their significance and stored them in a trunk that eventually made its way into a regional archive in the west of England. They were catalogued in 1923 and studied seriously for the first time in the 1970s by a historian who described them in a journal article that attracted limited attention as the most detailed private record of Victorian institutional corruption produced by any insider of that era. The notebooks were never published in full. They remain in the archive. The trunk that holds them is unlocked. The 12 societies did not disappear when the Victorian era ended. They adapted, as all durable systems do. Some merged, some renamed themselves. Some shed the more theatrical elements of their ritual, the robes, the passwords, the elaborate ceremony, and retained only the essential core, the private room, the mutual obligation, the shared understanding that what was decided here would not appear in any public record. The Freemasons reorganized their public image carefully in the early 20th century, emphasizing charity work and civic brotherhood while maintaining the internal architecture of preferential appointment and mutual protection. The Primrose League dissolved formally in 2004, nearly 120 years after its founding, having long since transferred its actual function to other structures. Other societies simply became less visible, which is not the same as becoming less active. What remained after all of it, after the exposures and the reforms and the 2 world wars that rearranged almost everything else about British society, was the template. The understanding, never written down, never formally transmitted, that power maintains itself not through force alone, but through the careful management of what is visible and what is not, that the official record of any institution is always a partial record, that the decisions which shape the lives of millions are never made entirely in the rooms where they are publicly announced. Somewhere in London tonight, in a building whose address does not appear in any registry, in a room lit the way rooms have always been lit when men want to speak without being overheard, that understanding is still operative. The gas lamps are gone. The oaths may have changed, but the room is the same room it has always been, and the names written in the books inside it are still not meant for anyone outside.